There was a couple who visited my clinic the other day. Both of them are into fitness and work out regularly. They have a fleet of dogs and take them out for long walks. Then they play a game of squash and finally they have a nice swim just to conclude the workout. They both follow intermittent fasting and are doing very well on that. But lately, the husband is just having one meal a day on a friend's suggestion and has managed to lose 6 kgs in just 1 month's time. Is this the right way to go about intermittent fasting? Well, to know more about it, continue listening to today's episode, where we will discuss everything about what you should eat in the feeding window to nourish and to heal. How to use intermittent fasting and feeding window to your advantage for gut healing. And finally, how you can shed some extra kilos by keeping the right kind of a feeding window. Hi, I'm Avantii Deshpaande, clinical nutritionist, author, speaker, entrepreneur, and a fit mom. Welcome to my podcast, Eat Smart with Avantii, reconnecting you back to the Indian roots. Let's recap part 1 of this series, Demystifying Intermittent Fasting. Intermittent fasting, also known as time-restricted feeding, is an eating plan that switches between fasting and eating on a regular schedule. Many diets focus on what to eat, but intermittent fasting is all about when you can eat. Intermittent fasting has a resemblance to upvas, which is mentioned in the science of Ayurveda. If intermittent fasting is done right, which means keeping the fasting window between 12 to 14 hours, it encourages autophagy, a process in which the body will heal itself. And that is possible only when the food that we eat is digested well. Along with this, it will also work towards healing the gut and ensure better response to insulin hormone for sugar control. It also ensures fat burning. So it definitely has an advantage for people who are trying to lose weight. Now in today's episode, let's start with the most important discussion. When is the best time to break the fast and how do you decide which is the best feeding window? For this, I'm going to refer to the part 1 of this series on demystifying intermittent fasting, where I spoke at length about what is circadian rhythm. So, if you have not heard part 1, now is the good time to pause this episode, go back to the earlier one and then revisit this one. The body's circadian timing systems is composed by a central clock in the hypothalamus in the brain known as SCN, that is suprachiasmatic nucleus. Then there are different peripheral tissue clocks involved in many metabolic rhythms, including the glucose and the lipids. The central clock dictates the food intake, energy expenditure, and the insulin sensitivity. Peripheral or the tissue clocks carry out an additional control. For instance, peripheral clock in the gut regulates the glucose absorption, and peripheral clock in the adipose tissue and the liver regulate the insulin tissue sensitivity, while another peripheral clock in the pancreas regulates the insulin secretion. The circadian rhythm or the 24-hour sleep-wake cycle is influenced by the exposure to light. Circadian rhythms can influence important functions in our body, such as hormone release, eating habits and digestion, and the body temperature. Feeding window might be best when it is kept between 8 am to 6 pm. Let me explain this. When the body clock aligns and syncs well to the release of the hormones like cortisol, insulin, and leptin, it will help in the better digestion and absorption of the food. Post 6 pm, when the sun sets and as the natural light diminishes, the body prepares for sleep. Now, keeping a feeding window towards the later part of the day might not be as beneficial as keeping the last meal before 6 pm. But of course, it might not be possible for a lot of people to have the last meal at 6 pm, especially the office-going people. So you can make it a point to have the last meal maybe 2 hours before you go to bed, so you get an advantage of having the food well digested before you go to bed. Now, the next thing I would like to address is the types of intermittent fasting. The first type is time-restricted feeding. In this option, you have a set fasting and eating windows. Since most people fast, During the sleep, this is the most popular method. Some of the common ways of doing it are the 16-8 method, where you fast for 16 hours and keep the eating or the feeding window for 8 hours. And the next one is 14-10 method, where you fast for 14 hours and you keep the feeding window as 10 hours. Now the next three types, which I'm about to explain, might be more of calorie restriction for weight loss rather than looking at just healing effects of intermittent fasting, which is autophagy. The next method is twice a week method, which is also known as 5/2 method. This approach to intermittent fasting focuses on capping your calories at 500 for 2 days a week. During the other 5 days of the week, you maintain a healthy and a normal diet. You can choose whichever 2 fasting days, say Tuesdays and Thursdays, as long as a non-fasting day is between them. Be sure to eat the same amount of food you normally would on the non-fasting days. The next type of intermittent fasting is alternate days fasting. This variation involves modified fasting every other day. For instance, limit your calorie on fasting days to 500 or about 25% of your normal food intake. On the non-fasting days, resume your regular and healthy diet. The last type of intermittent fasting is 24 hours fast, and it is also known as eat, stop, eat method. This method involves fasting completely for full 24 hours. Often it's only done once or 2 times a week. Most people fast from breakfast to breakfast or lunch to lunch. With this version of intermittent fasting, the side effects can be extreme, like fatigue, headaches, irritability, hunger, and low energy. If you follow this method, you should return to normal healthy diet on the non-fasting days. Now here's a disclaimer. I have never tried any of the last 3 approaches which I just mentioned with my clients, except for the time restricted feeding. But one thing which I definitely practice is carb cycling, which is cycling the diets between high carb, moderate, and low carbs. And you can find more about this on my Instagram. So go ahead and follow us there, nutritionist.avanti. If any of you has tried one of the last 3 approaches of intermittent fasting, do put it in the comments section. I would love to know more about it. Now, a subject very close to my heart. How do you plan your meals in the feeding window to ensure nourishment? The 8 hours feeding window should be utilized for nourishing the body, and the 16 hours of fasting window will ensure repair, healing, and fat burning. I'm going to quote the reference given by Dr. Sanchit Panda here. Dr. Panda is a PhD and a leading expert in the field of circadian rhythm research. And this is what he mentions. 1 hour after we wake up, the melatonin levels are still plummeting, and simultaneously the cortisol levels are at its peak. So it might not be the best time to start with a cup of coffee or a strong tea when you wake up in the morning. At least leave a gap of 30 minutes to 1 hour before you have this strong coffee or tea. It's best to have a non-calorie, non-stimulating beverage like herbal teas or infused water, or then simply having alkalizing drinks like apple cider vinegar, lemon water, or amla juice. Even having green juices without any fruit added to it might also be a great idea. Now the next interesting topic is, what should be the first food that you should consume when you are breaking the fast? Well, this depends upon what is the meal pattern that you're keeping. Are you keeping a 2 meal pattern in the day, or then are you planning to keep 3 to 4 meal pattern in the day? As a nutritionist, I would suggest that you plan your day's nutrient requirement for the 8 hours. Often managing this will be very difficult if you're having only 1 meal. That is why I would suggest that you at least have 2 to 3 meals in the 8 hours feeding window. The example which I gave in the beginning, where my client had only 1 meal in the day, and in that meal too he was restricting the carbs. So ultimately, the weight loss is going to happen because there is a lot of muscle loss which is happening rather than just the fat burning. So, even if you are on a calorie restricted diet where you're trying to shed the extra weight, I would suggest that keeping 2 to 3 meals in the day would definitely be a better idea, where you change the focus from high carbs, moderate protein, and low fats to high protein, moderate quantities of good fats, and low carbs. Okay, now let me give you an example. If the first meal is going to be breakfast after your fast is over, in place of just having tea and poha or upma, you can choose to have one bowl of poha and upma and combine this with either one glass of milk or one glass of buttermilk, and along with this you could have a fruit. If you do not wish to have milk first thing in the morning, you could have a fistful of almonds and walnuts, one bowl of poha, and one fruit. It's best to have a combination of carbs and proteins for breakfast. And even if you're very busy and you're just going to have smoothies for breakfast, you can have a carb in the form of probably just oats and combine it with the fruit. And if you want, you can have a nut milk added to it. For lunch and supper, you can eat by the healthy plate method. For this, you can have one portion of salad, one portion of sabzi or a curry, one portion of dal, or this could even be the lentils that you prepare, and carbs in the form of chapati, millet roti, or rice. And do not forget to add ghee for sure. As a source of probiotic, you can add a glass of buttermilk at your lunchtime or then at your supper time, or then you could have it at both times. During the feeding window, ensure that you're having all the food groups in the three major meals that you're having, which includes the fruit and the vegetable group in the form of salads and the sabzi, the protein in the form of dals, lentils, egg, chicken or fish, probiotic in the form of buttermilk, and do not forget carbs in the form of chapati, rice or millets. And of course, good fats also coming from the almonds and the walnuts or the seeds, and then adding ghee during your lunch and the suppers. You can probably add a portion of fruit in between these three meals to complete the daily requirement of the fruit and the vegetable group. If your feeding window starts at the lunchtime, then you can have a major meal, which is the lunch. You can have a light snack, or you can even skip it if you want. And then a major meal goes at around 8 pm, and this will complete your 8 hours of feeding window. If you're not hungry, you can just have a fruit in between, or you can have sips of drinks like buttermilk, vegetable juice, or even having infused water in between. Do not follow too low calorie diets along with intermittent fasting, as it is going to harm your body rather than heal it, and then you could end up having muscle wastage and several deficiencies. Now, the last point, and I think this is one of the most important points, that is, what are you going to consume during the fasting window? Technically speaking, eating or drinking any calories breaks a fast. So it's best to consume foods that do not add to any substantial calories, but in turn, they are going to work in healing the body. To encourage healing, bone broth, green vegetable juices, herbal drinks, or thin buttermilk is also good. I know what's on your mind. How about black tea and black coffee? Well, these seem to be obvious choices, but these are stimulants and they're just going to keep your brain active, and they do not add any specific benefits for healing. So it's best to wean off these habits as far as possible. So in this episode, we discussed about what is the best feeding window, what are the different types of intermittent fasting, how do you plan your diet to ensure nourishment, and finally, what are you allowed to have during the fasting window. Now next time, I'm going to discuss about how to plan your workouts during intermittent fasting and how to go about intermittent fasting if you have certain medical conditions, especially diabetes. So stay tuned for part 3 of Demystifying Intermittent Fasting. And do let me know if you're enjoying this series for sure. Have a beautiful week ahead and see you next week in part 3.